Before the beginning, before the idea of beginnings themselves, there was silence. Not the kind of silence that follows sound, but a silence that existed without contrast, without expectation, without interruption. A silence that did not wait to be filled, because waiting itself had not yet been born. There was no ticking of moments, no flow of seconds into minutes, no forward movement from past to future, because time had not yet taken its first breath. And in that silence there was no emptiness, only completeness, a fullness so absolute that nothing needed to be added and nothing could be taken away. For God existed beyond time, not bound by it, not moving through it, not aging within it, but standing outside it altogether, seeing what would one day be called history as a single unified reality, holding the end and the beginning together without effort, without strain, without sequence. For God did not come into being and will not pass away, but simply is, eternally present, eternally aware, eternally sufficient. And so when we speak of before, we are already using human language that bends under the weight of divine reality, because before assumes a timeline, and there was none, only God, existing in perfect being, perfect will, perfect intention, needing nothing beyond himself, yet choosing in freedom and purpose to create. And this choice did not arise from loneliness, nor from lack, nor from necessity, but from will, from meaning, from the desire to give form where there was no form, to bring order where there was no order, to call into existence what did not yet exist. And when Scripture says, "in the beginning," it is not merely marking a starting point like the opening of a story, but declaring the moment when time itself began, when the first measurable instant came into being, when eternity touched what would become the temporal world. And the phrase, "in the beginning," stands like a doorway between the infinite and the finite, telling us that everything we know, space, matter, energy, motion, cause and effect, had an origin, and that origin was not random, not accidental, not the result of chaos, but the deliberate act of God. The beginning was not God's beginning, for God has no beginning, but the beginning of creation, the moment when the universe received its first heartbeat, when existence moved from possibility to reality through divine command. And this matters deeply because it means the world is not self-made, humanity is not self-defined, and meaning is not something we invent to fill the silence, but something embedded into creation from its very first moment. The silence before creation was not empty, it was pregnant with intention, carrying within it the unseen blueprint of everything that would come to be. And when the beginning arrived, it did so not with struggle or conflict, but with authority and clarity. For God did not wrestle creation into existence, He spoke, and speech itself implies meaning, order, intelligence, and purpose. To say "in the beginning" is to say that reality is grounded in intention, that existence is not a cosmic accident drifting without direction, but a designed unfolding of a will greater than time. And this reshapes how we understand ourselves, because if time had a beginning, then it also has direction, and if it has direction, then history is not circular chaos, but a story moving toward fulfillment. God beyond time means God is not surprised by events, not confined to moments, not reacting in uncertainty, but fully present to every moment at once, knowing the rise and fall of civilizations, the quiet thoughts of the human heart, the turning of galaxies, and the final breath of the last generation, all without being overwhelmed or diminished. And yet, despite existing beyond time, God chose to enter time, to create within it, to act within it, and to be known within it, which means the beginning was not distant or detached, but personal, intentional, and relational. In the beginning is therefore not just a statement about origins, but a declaration of authority, claiming that everything that exists owes its existence to God, that nothing stands outside His creative will, and that even time itself is a created thing, subject to Him, sustained by Him, and moving according to His design. The silence before creation was not a void of nothingness, but the calm before meaning, the stillness before order, the quiet in which purpose waited to be spoken. And when the beginning came, it did not break that silence violently, but transformed it, turning stillness into structure, quiet into rhythm, and eternity into a story that would unfold through days and nights, generations and ages, all flowing from that first moment when God, beyond time, brought time into being and declared that existence itself had begun.
Light came not as a gradual glow rising from darkness, not as a flicker struggling to survive, but as a decisive act, a spoken command that carried authority within it. For when God said, "Let there be light," light did not argue with the darkness, did not negotiate space, did not evolve slowly over time, but simply was, bursting into existence at the sound of divine will, filling what had been formless and empty with clarity, visibility, and distinction, because light in its very nature reveals, separates, and defines, and its creation marked the first great act of order imposed upon the unshaped deep. Before light, there was no contrast, no boundary, no way to distinguish one state from another, but with light came the ability to see, to perceive, to recognize difference, and this moment was not merely physical illumination, but the establishment of structure itself, the beginning of a universe that could be known, measured, and inhabited. For God saw that the light was good, not only because it shone, but because it served a purpose, and goodness in creation is always tied to purpose fulfilled. Then came the separation of light from darkness, an act that did not destroy darkness, but assigned it a place, showing that order does not require the elimination of contrast, but the proper arrangement of it. And God called the light day and the darkness night, naming them, because to name is to define, to give identity, to place within a meaningful framework, and in doing so, God established the first rhythm of existence, a cycle that would govern the world from that moment forward, evening and morning, darkness and light, rest and activity, not as opposing forces locked in conflict, but as complementary movements within a designed pattern. This separation introduced time as experienced reality, not as abstract measurement, but as lived rhythm, a sequence that allowed creation to breathe, to move, to unfold in an ordered way. For time was no longer a vague concept, but a lived structure marked by repetition and consistency, and this rhythm would become the heartbeat of the cosmos, shaping days, seasons, life cycles, work, rest, growth, and renewal. Light defined the day, darkness defined the night, and together they formed a balance that made life possible, teaching that order is not monotony, but harmony, not endless brightness nor endless shadow, but a measured alternation that gives meaning to both. And in this rhythm we see intention, because a world without night would never rest, and a world without day would never grow. So purpose was woven into the very fabric of time from its first moment. The creation of light also revealed that God does not create chaos and then attempt to fix it, but speaks order from the outset, transforming what is formless into something structured and meaningful. And this act tells us that confusion is not the original state of reality, but order is, that meaning precedes disorder and clarity precedes confusion, even if the world later experiences distortion. The separation of light and darkness also establishes boundaries, and boundaries are not limitations meant to restrict goodness, but frameworks that allow goodness to exist, because without separation there can be no identity, and without identity there can be no purpose. So by dividing light from darkness, God was not fragmenting creation, but organizing it, setting the stage for everything that would follow. Time, then, was no longer endless sameness, but purposeful progression, marked by movement from evening to morning, teaching that every period of darkness gives way to light, and every light eventually yields to rest, a truth that would echo through human existence as labor and Sabbath, striving and restoration, sorrow and hope. This rhythm also reveals that creation is not static but dynamic, meant to move forward, to develop, to unfold according to God's design. And in this movement we find assurance that life has direction, that moments are not random but placed within a larger story, and that even when darkness comes, it comes within limits, never outside the bounds of divine order. Light was created before the sun, reminding us that illumination does not depend solely on physical sources, but on divine will, that meaning and clarity originate from God Himself, not merely from created things. And this truth reaches beyond physics into the realm of understanding, showing that insight, wisdom, and truth are not self-generated by the world, but given, spoken into existence by the one who orders reality. The declaration that the light was good affirms that creation is not morally neutral at its core, but intentionally aligned toward goodness, that order itself is a gift, and that purpose is not imposed later by human interpretation, but embedded from the beginning. And as the cycle of evening and morning closed the first day, time itself became sacred movement, a measured unfolding that would carry creation forward toward fullness, growth, and meaning. Thus, light and order were not simply the first creative acts, but the foundation upon which all other acts would stand, because without light, nothing can be seen, without order, nothing can endure, without rhythm, nothing can live, and without purpose, nothing can matter. And in this first movement of creation, we see that existence itself is structured by intention, guided by wisdom, and sustained by a God who brings clarity out of chaos, rhythm out of stillness, and meaning out of the void, establishing from the very first day that the universe is not a place of random motion, but a carefully ordered reality, moving according to a purpose spoken into being by divine command.
The shaping of the world unfolded not in haste or confusion, but with deliberate care, as God spoke structure into what had been unformed, turning the deep, restless waters into a world that could sustain life, beginning with the separation of sky and seas, an act that gave space its first true dimension, and order its first visible form. For before this moment, the waters covered everything, indistinguishable and boundless, but at God's command an expanse was formed, stretching outward and upward, creating a vast open space that divided the waters below from the waters above. And this expanse was called the sky, not merely as a label, but as a declaration of function, a place of movement, breath, and openness, where clouds would gather, winds would travel, and light would pass freely, giving the world depth rather than flatness, and possibility rather than confinement. The sky was not an afterthought, but an essential framework, a reminder that creation was not meant to be crowded or compressed, but spacious and ordered, allowing life to exist within defined boundaries. And by separating the waters, God demonstrated once again that order does not eliminate elements, but assigns them purpose and place, because the waters below would become seas, essential for life and balance, while the waters above would serve their own role in sustaining the earth, showing that separation in creation is never rejection, but organization.
As the shaping continued, God gathered the waters beneath the sky into designated places, causing them to retreat and collect so that dry land could emerge. And this moment marked a profound transition, as solid ground appeared for the first time, firm and stable, rising from beneath the waters like a foundation laid with intention. And God called this dry land earth, while the gathered waters he called seas. And in naming them, he affirmed their identities and roles, establishing a world that was no longer undefined but articulated, no longer hidden beneath chaos but revealed through order. The emergence of dry land was more than a geological event. It was the preparation of a dwelling place, a surface where life could take root, where growth could occur, where creatures could walk, rest, and multiply. And this tells us that creation was always moving toward habitability, toward relationship, toward life, not merely existing for its own sake, but being shaped with future purpose in mind. The seas were given boundaries, held in place by divine command, demonstrating that even the most powerful and untamable forces of nature operate within limits established by God. And this containment was not restrictive but life-giving, for without boundaries, the waters would overwhelm everything, and without dry land, there could be no place for life to flourish. So restraint itself became an expression of care. As the land emerged and the seas settled into their appointed places, the world began to take on coherence, a sense of belonging and balance, where each element supported the others, sky above, seas below, land between, all interconnected yet distinct, forming a stable environment where life could eventually thrive. And when God looked upon this shaping work, he saw that it was good, a declaration that carried weight and meaning. For goodness in creation is not aesthetic alone, but functional and purposeful, meaning that the world was not only beautiful, but fit for what it was designed to become, aligned with the intention behind it, capable of sustaining the unfolding plan of life. God calling creation good also reveals that the material world is not flawed by nature, not inferior or corrupt at its origin, but intentionally designed and affirmed, bearing value simply because it was made by God. And this affirmation stands against any notion that the physical world is meaningless or disposable, for from the beginning it was declared worthy, ordered, and filled with purpose. The shaping of the world teaches us that God works through process, not because he lacks power to complete everything instantly, but because sequence itself carries meaning, showing progression from formlessness to structure, from potential to reality, from chaos to harmony. And each stage builds upon the last, revealing a creator who delights in order, balance, and intentional design. Sky and seas, land and water, all exist in relationship, each dependent on the others, illustrating that creation is not a collection of isolated elements, but an integrated whole, where separation serves unity rather than division, and diversity contributes to stability rather than disorder. The declaration of goodness at this stage also signals satisfaction, not completion, but alignment, as if creation has reached a point where it is ready for what comes next, a foundation firmly laid upon which life, movement, and complexity can be added. And this goodness sets the tone for everything that follows, affirming that the world was created in not conflict or tension, but in harmony with divine intention. The shaping of the world also reflects a deeper truth about God's character, that he is not a distant force acting randomly, but a purposeful creator who sees value in structure, who names what he creates, who establishes boundaries not to restrict, but to protect, and who affirms the goodness of his work, inviting us to see the world not as an accident or a battleground of opposing forces, but as a carefully ordered reality shaped by wisdom and care. And as sky stretched above, seas settled below, and land stood firm between them, the world became a place of readiness, a stage prepared for life, growth, and relationship, and God's declaration that it was good echoed as a foundational truth, reminding us that existence itself began not in error or deficiency, but in intention and approval, that the world was shaped to sustain life, reflect order, and serve a purpose greater than itself, and that from its earliest form, creation bore the mark of a creator who brings harmony out of chaos, stability out of formlessness, and goodness into being through deliberate, meaningful design.
The heavens were declared not as distant ornaments placed beyond human concern, but as purposeful elements woven into the ordered fabric of creation, unveiled when God appointed the sun, the moon, and the stars to their roles, transforming the sky from an empty expanse into a vast functioning system of light, rhythm, and guidance. For these lights were not created merely to shine, but to govern, to mark, and to serve, establishing a cosmic order that would shape life on Earth in ways both visible and subtle. The sun was given dominion over the day, pouring light and warmth across the land, driving the cycles of growth and rest, awakening the world each morning, and sustaining every living thing through its steady presence, not as a deity to be worshipped, but as a created servant fulfilling a divine purpose, while the moon was appointed to rule the night, reflecting light into darkness, offering gentle illumination when the sun had set, marking the passage of months and reminding the world that even in darkness, light is never fully absent. Alongside them, the stars were scattered across the heavens in vast number, not randomly, but intentionally placed, filling the night sky with wonder and depth, serving as markers of time, direction, and season, guiding travelers, shaping calendars, and inspiring awe. Their silent brilliance speaking of order rather than chaos, intention rather than chance. These lights were established as signs, not in the sense of superstition or fate, but as indicators, signals embedded in creation to communicate rhythm and structure, marking days and years, seasons and appointed times, allowing life on Earth to move in harmony with the heavens above. For without such markers, time would blur into confusion, and existence would lose its cadence. But with them came predictability, stability, and trust, as humanity could look to the sky and know when to plant and when to harvest, when to rest and when to labor, when to celebrate and when to wait. Seasons themselves became expressions of divine order, cycles of birth and growth, decline and rest, each with its own beauty and necessity, teaching that change is not a failure of design, but a feature of it, that life is sustained not by endless sameness, but by rhythmic variation, and that every phase has its appointed role within a larger pattern. Spring awakens, summer strengthens, autumn gathers, winter restores, and together they form a living testimony that creation is governed by wisdom rather than impulse, by timing rather than randomness, and this cosmic rhythm reaches beyond agriculture and climate into the human experience itself, shaping emotions, expectations, and understanding, reminding humanity that life moves in seasons as well, each one meaningful even when difficult. The declaration of the heavens also places humanity within the cosmos in a position both humble and honored. For when humans look upward and see the vastness of the sky, the immeasurable distances, the countless stars, they are confronted with their smallness, realizing they are not the center of the universe by scale or power, and yet at the same time they are revealed as deeply significant, because these immense systems were set in motion with human life in mind, ordered in such a way that life could exist, flourish, and endure on a small planet beneath a vast sky.
Humanity's place in the cosmos is therefore not one of insignificance, but of stewardship and awareness, positioned at the intersection of earth and heaven, grounded in the soil, yet gazing toward the stars, capable of measuring time, observing patterns, and seeking meaning. And this dual position invites reflection, responsibility, and humility, as humans are neither gods ruling the heavens nor accidents lost within them, but creatures given understanding within an ordered universe. The sun, moon, and stars also remind humanity that light is given, not owned, that time is entrusted, not controlled, and that existence unfolds within limits that are not oppressive but sustaining. For without the consistency of the heavens, life would collapse into unpredictability, and without their order, trust in the future would erode. But because they move faithfully in their courses, humanity can plan, hope, and endure. The heavens declared also challenge the temptation to see meaning as self-created, because the sky itself speaks of an order that precedes human thought, an arrangement that existed before any observer could name it, suggesting that meaning is discovered rather than invented, and that humanity lives within a story already in motion, shaped by rhythms older than memory and larger than imagination. At the same time, the declaration of the heavens affirms that humanity is not merely a passive observer, but an engaged participant, capable of interpreting signs, learning seasons, and aligning life with the rhythms established in creation. And this capacity to understand and respond reflects a unique role, one that carries responsibility rather than domination, inviting humanity to live in harmony with the cosmos rather than in defiance of it. The stars, distant and unreachable, inspire wonder rather than control, reminding humanity that not everything exists to be mastered, that some things are meant to be contemplated, admired, and respected, and this sense of wonder guards against arrogance, grounding human ambition within a larger perspective that values balance over excess and reverence over exploitation. The heavens also serve as a constant witness, unchanging in their faithfulness even as human generations rise and fall, their steady presence offering continuity across time, linking past, present, and future, and reminding humanity that life is part of a larger narrative unfolding according to order rather than chaos. When God declared the lights of the heavens, He did not merely illuminate the sky, but illuminated existence itself, embedding time with meaning, change with purpose, and humanity with a place that is neither accidental nor isolated, but deeply connected to the rhythms of creation. The cosmos became a grand clock, a living calendar, and a silent teacher, revealing that life unfolds according to appointed times, that growth and rest are both necessary, and that meaning is sustained through order. Humanity's place in this vast system is therefore one of attentive presence, called to observe, to learn, to steward, and to live in alignment with the rhythms embedded in the fabric of the universe, recognizing that the same wisdom that governs the movement of stars also undergirds human existence, and that by honoring these rhythms, humanity finds not limitation, but life, not insignificance, but belonging, standing beneath the heavens not as lost wanderers in an indifferent cosmos, but as intentional participants within a universe declared, ordered, and sustained with purpose from the beginning.
Life upon the earth began as a quiet unfolding of abundance, not rushed or forced, but spoken into being with intention and generosity, as the land that had emerged firm and ready was commanded to bring forth life from within itself, and at once the earth responded, producing plants and vegetation of every kind, grasses that spread like living carpets across the ground, seed-bearing plants capable of renewal and continuity,
and trees rising upward, rooted deep yet reaching toward the sky, each bearing fruit according to its kind, carrying within itself the promise of future life. For this was not creation meant to fade after a single moment, but creation designed for endurance, growth, and multiplication. Vegetation was not merely decoration, but provision, establishing from the beginning that the world was meant to sustain life, that nourishment was woven into the fabric of creation itself, and that survival would not depend on constant divine intervention, but on systems of provision already built into the earth, reflecting foresight and care. Plants transformed light into nourishment, soil into sustenance, turning the rhythms of sun and rain into food, oxygen, and stability, and in doing so they became the quiet foundation upon which all other forms of life would depend, teaching that the most essential contributions are often the least dramatic, and that life flourishes not through spectacle alone, but through steady, faithful processes. As the earth filled with green, God saw that it was good, affirming once more that life itself is good, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived reality, a blessing expressed through growth, color, texture, and renewal. Then life expanded beyond the land into the waters and the skies, as God commanded the seas to swarm with living creatures, filling the depths with movement and diversity, fish of countless forms and sizes gliding through currents, creatures unseen by human eyes inhabiting the vast hidden worlds beneath the surface, each adapted to its environment, each fulfilling a role within a balanced system, showing that life was not limited to what was easily visible or immediately useful to humanity, but abundant beyond measure, extending into realms of mystery and depth. The seas became places of motion and vitality rather than emptiness, reminding us that even what appears chaotic or unfathomable is ordered and inhabited under divine design. Above the waters and land, the sky was filled with birds, winged creatures taking flight for the first time, moving freely through the open expanse, their wings beating in rhythm with the air, filling the heavens with motion, sound, and life. And this act completed a threefold harmony of land, sea, and sky, each realm populated according to its nature, none encroaching upon the other, yet all existing together in balance. The creatures of sea and sky were blessed, commanded to be fruitful and multiply, a blessing that carried both permission and promise, for multiplication was not framed as burden, but as gift, an invitation to fill the world with life, diversity, and motion, reflecting a creator who delights in fullness rather than scarcity, in abundance rather than minimalism. This blessing reveals that life was never meant to exist at the edge of survival alone, but to flourish, to spread, to explore the breadth of creation. And this principle of abundance challenges any view of existence rooted in fear or limitation, because from the beginning, God's posture toward life was generous, not restrictive. The diversity of living creatures also reveals intentional creativity, not repetition without thought, but variation with purpose, each species suited to its environment, each form reflecting adaptability and resilience, demonstrating that unity does not require uniformity and that richness of life emerges through difference held within order. Plants and animals were created not in isolation, but in relationship, forming ecosystems where each depended on others, vegetation feeding creatures, creatures shaping environments, all contributing to a living web sustained by balance rather than domination. And this interdependence teaches that life is communal by nature, not solitary, and that survival is linked to harmony rather than conquest. God's blessing upon living creatures affirms that existence itself is a gift worthy of continuation, that reproduction and growth are not accidents of biology, but expressions of divine intent, and that life carries forward under a mantle of approval rather than indifference.
Abundance in creation also reflects trust, for a world designed with self-renewing systems assumes continuity, a future where life persists and multiplies. And this trust embedded in creation invites humanity, when it later appears, to live with confidence rather than anxiety, to see the world not as a fragile accident constantly on the verge of collapse, but a resilient, sustained reality under divine care. The filling of sea and sky also adds movement to the stillness of land and plants, introducing rhythm, migration, patterns of behavior, and cycles of life that would continue across generations, making the world dynamic rather than static, alive rather than merely functional. Birds soaring and fish swimming became living expressions of freedom within order, moving according to instinct and design, not constrained by chaos, but guided by purpose. God's declaration of goodness at this stage signals satisfaction with the abundance and balance achieved, showing that life in its diversity was not excessive but appropriate, not overwhelming but harmonious, and that fullness itself was part of the design. Abundance does not mean excess without control, but richness within boundaries, and this principle is evident in how life was blessed to multiply within the frameworks already established, guided by rhythms of time, seasons, and provision. The earth, now alive with plants, waters teeming with creatures, and skies filled with flight, became a world of generosity, a place where life was not hoarded but shared, where energy flowed from sun to plant to creature, sustaining countless forms without depletion, reflecting a creator whose resources are not finite and whose generosity is not threatened by sharing. This abundance also sets the moral tone of creation, implying that scarcity and exploitation are not original conditions but later distortions, and that the natural posture of the world, as designed, is one of provision and balance. Life upon the earth was therefore not a random explosion of organisms, but a carefully ordered flourishing, guided by blessing rather than competition, purpose rather than survival alone, and goodness rather than neutrality. Plants rooted life in the soil, creatures animated the seas and skies, and blessing wove continuity into every living thing, ensuring that creation would not merely exist for a moment, but endure through time. And in this unfolding abundance, we see a world prepared not only to sustain life, but to welcome humanity when it would arrive, offering food, beauty, rhythm, and balance, revealing that from the very beginning, the earth was shaped as a place of generosity, where life was invited to flourish under blessing, within order, and toward a future filled with growth, diversity, and meaning.
The creation of humanity stands as the most intimate and deliberate act within the unfolding of creation, marked not by command alone, but by intention expressed in relational language, as God declared the purpose to make humanity in His own image, signaling a shift from forming environments and filling them with life to creating beings capable of awareness, relationship, and responsibility. For to be made in God's image does not mean to mirror physical form, but to reflect qualities of being, such as reason, creativity, moral awareness, and the capacity for relationship, positioning humanity as a living reflection of divine intention within the created world. This declaration sets humanity apart from every other creature, not as superior in value alone, but as unique in role, entrusted with the ability to perceive meaning, to make choices, and to engage consciously with both creator and creation, bearing within themselves a resemblance that is functional and relational rather than material. The image of God imbued humanity with dignity from the very first moment, a dignity not earned through achievement or status, but granted by design, meaning that human worth is inherent, not conditional, and rooted in origin rather than performance. And this truth reshapes how humanity understands itself and one another, for if all humans bear this image, then value is universal and inviolable, regardless of age, strength, or circumstance.
Humanity was created male and female, not as a division that fragments the image, but as a shared expression of it, revealing that the image of God is not confined to one form or role, but expressed through relationship, complementarity, and shared existence, for neither male nor female alone exhausts the fullness of the image, but together they reflect relationality, cooperation, and unity within diversity, showing that difference is not a flaw, but an intentional feature of design. Male and female were created equal in dignity and purpose, yet distinct in expression, each bringing unique perspectives, strengths, and capacities, and this distinction was not given to create hierarchy or competition, but partnership, mutuality, and shared stewardship, illustrating that humanity was meant to flourish through cooperation rather than dominance, and that the image of God is reflected not only in individuals, but in community. The creation of humanity as relational beings mirrors the relational nature of God Himself, suggesting that relationship is not a secondary aspect of existence, but central to it, and that isolation is not humanity's natural state, but connection, communication, and shared life. Authority was then entrusted to humanity, not as unchecked power, but as delegated responsibility, granting them stewardship over the earth, the creatures of land, sea, and sky, and the resources of the world, establishing humans as caretakers rather than owners, rulers rather than exploiters, and this authority was rooted in service rather than control, reflecting God's own manner of governance, which sustains, orders, and provides, rather than consumes or destroys. To rule over creation was not permission to abuse it, but a call to cultivate, protect, and guide it toward flourishing, aligning human action with divine intention. And this responsibility required wisdom, restraint, and accountability, because delegated authority implies trust and expectation. Humanity's authority was therefore inseparable from responsibility, as power without purpose would distort the image it was meant to reflect, and stewardship without care would betray the trust placed in it. So humanity's role was defined not merely by what they could do, but how they were meant to do it, exercising dominion that mirrors divine care rather than human impulse. Being made in God's image also meant humanity was capable of moral discernment, able to recognize good and evil, right and wrong, and to act with intention rather than instinct alone. And this capacity elevated human existence beyond survival, introducing ethical responsibility into the fabric of life, for actions would carry meaning, consequences, and accountability, not only toward one another, but toward the Creator whose image they bore. The command to be fruitful and multiply extended this responsibility into the future, framing growth and reproduction not as mere biological functions, but as participation in the ongoing unfolding of creation, inviting humanity to extend care, order, and relationship across generations, shaping the world not only physically, but culturally, socially, and morally. Multiplication was not intended to dilute responsibility, but to spread it, ensuring that stewardship, dignity, and relational life would fill the earth alongside humanity itself. The image of God within humanity also implied creativity, the ability to shape environments, develop tools, build communities, and express beauty, reflecting the creative nature of the Creator. And this creative impulse was meant to operate within the boundaries of wisdom and care, enhancing life rather than consuming it, and building systems that sustain rather than exploit. Humanity's unique role placed them at the intersection of heaven and earth, capable of understanding the rhythms of creation while also seeking meaning beyond it, aware of physical needs yet drawn toward purpose, reflection, and transcendence. And this dual awareness positioned humans as interpreters of creation, able to observe, name, and understand the world in ways no other creature could. Male and female together embodied this calling, reflecting a shared responsibility to steward the world, nurture life, and maintain balance. And this shared calling affirms that authority in creation was never intended to be isolated within one individual or group, but distributed across humanity as a whole, requiring cooperation, humility, and mutual respect. The creation of humanity also introduces vulnerability, because beings capable of choice are also capable of failure, and authority entrusted can be misused. But this risk was embraced within creation, suggesting that genuine relationship and responsibility require freedom rather than control, and that the image of God includes the capacity to choose alignment or deviation. Nevertheless, the original intent remains clear, that humanity was created good, entrusted, dignified, and purposed, not as an afterthought, but as a central participant in the story of creation, bearing within themselves a reflection of the Creator and a calling to act in accordance with that reflection. Authority and responsibility together form the core of humanity's role, ensuring that power is guided by purpose and freedom by accountability. And when these are held together, humanity lives in harmony with creation and Creator alike. The creation of humanity therefore marks not only the arrival of human life, but the introduction of moral agency, relational depth, and purposeful stewardship into the world, establishing from the beginning that humanity's place is neither accidental nor absolute, but entrusted, meaningful, and defined by reflection of the One in whose image they were made, called to live with dignity, to relate with integrity, and to steward creation with wisdom, care, and responsibility.
The breath of life marks one of the most intimate and revealing moments in the story of creation, where humanity is not only spoken into existence, but personally formed, shaped from the dust of the ground, emphasizing both humility and intention. For dust is ordinary, common, and fragile, reminding humanity of its material nature, its connection to the earth, and its dependence on the world from which it was formed. Yet this humble origin does not diminish human worth, but grounds it, showing that significance does not arise from materials alone, but from the purpose and care with which they are shaped. God formed the human body deliberately, not hastily, crafting a being that was physically complete, yet not fully alive, a form prepared to receive something more, something that no other created being would receive in the same way. And this pause between formation and animation reveals that humanity is more than matter arranged in complexity, more than biological machinery, because without the breath of God, the human form remained lifeless, complete in structure, but incomplete in essence. Then God breathed into the human nostrils the breath of life, a direct, personal act that transformed dust into a living being. And this breath was not merely oxygen filling lungs, but a divine impartation of life itself, an act that bridges the infinite and the finite, connecting the eternal Creator with a temporal creature in a way that is both profound and mysterious. This moment reveals that life, at its core, is not self-generated, but received, not accidental, but bestowed, and that human existence begins not with motion or thought, but with divine intention expressed through intimate closeness. The breath of God signifies relationship, for breath requires proximity, presence, and intention, and unlike the creation of plants or animals through spoken command alone, humanity's animation involves touch, nearness, and direct impartation, underscoring the unique status of humans within creation. This breath also signifies dependence, for every breath humanity takes thereafter echoes that first breath, a reminder that life is sustained moment by moment, not owned or controlled, and that the rhythm of breathing itself becomes a living symbol of reliance on something beyond the self. Through this divine breath, humans became living beings, capable of awareness, reflection, emotion, and moral discernment, animated not only physically but inwardly, carrying within themselves a spark that connects them to the source of life. And this connection distinguishes humans from all other creatures, not by superiority of strength or instinct, but by capacity for relationship, understanding, and purpose. The uniqueness of humans is therefore rooted not in form alone, but in origin and animation, in the way life was given rather than merely produced. And this uniqueness carries implications for identity, dignity, and responsibility, because a being who receives life directly from God is inherently relational, oriented toward meaning and connection rather than mere survival. Humans, formed from dust, remain creatures of the earth, bound to physical limits, vulnerability, and mortality, yet the breath of God lifts human existence beyond mere materiality, creating a tension that defines the human condition, grounded yet reaching, finite yet aware of the infinite, fragile yet capable of profound creativity and love. This dual nature explains why humans experience longing, curiosity, and restlessness, sensing that life is more than consumption and reproduction, more than instinct and habit, because the breath within them carries an echo of something eternal, drawing them toward purpose, reflection, and transcendence. The uniqueness of humans is also expressed in their capacity for self-awareness, the ability to know that they exist, to reflect on their actions, to imagine futures, to remember the past, and to ask questions of meaning. And this awareness flows directly from the breath that animates them, distinguishing human life as not only biological, but existential, not only living, but aware of living. With this awareness comes moral responsibility, because beings who can reflect and choose are accountable for how they act, how they treat others, and how they steward the world around them. And this responsibility is inseparable from the breath of life, for it is the breath that enables choice, conscience, and compassion. Humans can create, speak, name, and shape their environment because the breath within them fuels communication, expression, and creativity, reflecting the creative nature of the one who breathed life into them. And this creative impulse is not accidental, but an extension of divine intention, inviting humans to participate in the ongoing shaping of the world through wisdom and care. The breath of life also establishes the sacredness of human existence, because what is directly given by God carries inherent value, making human life worthy of protection, respect, and dignity, regardless of condition or capability. Even in weakness, illness, or age, the breath remains a sign of divine gift, affirming that worth does not diminish by productivity or strength. The formation from dust and the impartation of breath together create a complete picture of humanity, reminding humans of both their limitations and their calling, grounding humility without erasing dignity, and elevating purpose without denying fragility. And this balance guards against pride on one hand and despair on the other, teaching that humans are neither gods nor accidents, but entrusted beings living between earth and heaven. The breath of God also implies that life is relationally sustained, not merely initiated, because breath must continue moment after moment, and this ongoing dependence invites trust, gratitude, and reverence, shaping how humans relate to God, to one another, and to creation. When humans forget their origin in dust, pride grows, and when they forget the breath that animates them, meaning fades. But when both are remembered together, humanity finds its proper place, living with humility, wonder, and responsibility. The uniqueness of humans is therefore rooted not in form alone, but in origin and animation, in the way life was given rather than merely produced, and this uniqueness carries implications for identity, dignity, and responsibility, because a being who receives life directly from God is inherently relational, oriented toward meaning and connection rather than mere survival.
Humans, formed from dust, remain creatures of the earth, bound to physical limits, vulnerability, and mortality. Yet the breath of God lifts human existence beyond mere materiality, creating a tension that defines the human condition, grounded yet reaching, finite yet aware of the infinite, fragile yet capable of profound creativity and love. This dual nature explains why humans experience longing, curiosity, and restlessness, sensing that life is more than consumption and reproduction, more than instinct and habit, because the breath within them carries an echo of something eternal, drawing them toward purpose, reflection, and transcendence. The uniqueness of humans is also expressed in their capacity for self-awareness, the ability to know that they exist, to reflect on their actions, to imagine futures, to remember the past, and to ask questions of meaning. And this awareness flows directly from the breath that animates them, distinguishing human life as not only biological, but existential, not only living, but aware of living. With this awareness comes moral responsibility, because beings who can reflect and choose are accountable for how they act, how they treat others, and how they steward the world around them. And this responsibility is inseparable from the breath of life, for it is the breath that enables choice, conscience, and compassion. Humans can create, speak, name, and shape their environment because the breath within them fuels communication, expression, and creativity, reflecting the creative nature of the one who breathed life into them. And this creative impulse is not accidental, but an extension of divine intention, inviting humans to participate in the ongoing shaping of the world through wisdom and care. The breath of life also establishes the sacredness of human existence, because what is directly given by God carries inherent value, making human life worthy of protection, respect, and dignity, regardless of condition or capability. Even in weakness, illness, or age, the breath remains a sign of divine gift, affirming that worth does not diminish by productivity or strength. The formation from dust and the impartation of breath together create a complete picture of humanity, reminding humans of both their limitations and their calling, grounding humility without erasing dignity, and elevating purpose without denying fragility. And this balance guards against pride on one hand and despair on the other, teaching that humans are neither gods nor accidents, but entrusted beings living between earth and heaven. The breath of God also implies that life is relationally sustained, not merely initiated, because breath must continue moment after moment, and this ongoing dependence invites trust, gratitude, and reverence, shaping how humans relate to God, to one another, and to creation.
The Garden of Eden is presented as a place of intentional beauty and ordered life, not merely a setting, but a living expression of harmony between God, humanity, and creation. Planted by God Himself as a cultivated space rather than untamed wilderness, revealing care, purpose, and relational design from the very beginning. Eden is described as a garden filled with trees that were both pleasing to the sight and good for food, showing that beauty and provision were never meant to be separated, that delight and necessity coexist naturally within God's design, and that the world was created not only to sustain life, but to enrich it, engaging the senses and nurturing joy as well as survival. Every tree, plant, and pathway within the garden reflects abundance rather than scarcity, order rather than chaos, and generosity rather than restraint, creating an environment where nothing was withheld out of fear and nothing hoarded out of insecurity, because trust defined the structure of life. At the heart of Eden flowed a river that watered the garden, a constant source of nourishment and vitality, branching into 4 great rivers that extended beyond the garden into the surrounding lands, symbolizing life that does not remain contained but overflows outward, carrying provision, fertility, and connection to the wider world.
And this flowing water represents continuity, movement, and sustaining presence, ensuring that the garden was never stagnant, but always alive, refreshed, and renewed. The naming of these rivers grounds Eden in tangible reality, reinforcing that this harmony was not imagined, but embodied in a real place where geography, beauty, and life intersected. And the mention of gold, precious stones, and fragrant resin in nearby lands emphasizes that value and richness were woven into the earth from the start, not introduced later by human desire, and that creation itself carried intrinsic worth apart from exploitation or ownership. Life in Eden existed in harmony, a state where humanity lived in unbroken relationship with God, the natural world, and one another, free from fear, shame, or conflict. And this harmony did not imply passivity or idleness, because humanity was placed in the garden to work it and care for it, showing that meaningful labor was part of original design, not a punishment, and that work aligned with purpose is life-giving rather than burdensome. Tending the garden was an act of partnership rather than domination, reflecting stewardship rather than control, and revealing that humanity's role was to cultivate what God had planted, working with creation rather than against it. Within Eden, humanity experienced direct and open relationship with God, existing fully known yet unafraid, indicating that vulnerability was safe, trust was complete, and awareness of divine presence was not overwhelming but sustaining, woven naturally into daily existence rather than confined to ritual or distance. The absence of shame reveals that harmony extended inward, shaping the human heart as well as the environment, allowing humans to exist without self-consciousness or fear of exposure, fully integrated within themselves and their surroundings. The natural world within Eden supported life without resistance, suggesting a balance where creation itself cooperated rather than conflicted, and where the environment responded to human presence with generosity rather than hostility, reinforcing the idea that struggle and exploitation are not original conditions, but later distortions. Eden also reflects the integration of freedom and boundary, as humanity was invited to enjoy the abundance of the garden while living within a framework of trust and obedience, showing that harmony does not require the absence of limits, but the presence of understanding, and that freedom flourishes best when aligned with purpose. The rhythms of life in Eden flowed naturally from the order of creation, marked by day and night, growth and rest, work and enjoyment, creating a stable and nurturing pattern that sustained both body and spirit. Eden stands as a vision of wholeness, where everything existed in proper relationship, nothing competed for dominance, and no element existed in isolation, offering a glimpse of life as it was intended to be, ordered by trust rather than fear, generosity rather than scarcity, and cooperation rather than control. The garden was not merely a place of beauty, but a space of belonging, where humanity knew its role, creation responded in balance, and God's presence was near and accessible, making ordinary life sacred without effort. Eden, therefore, represents more than a beginning. It embodies a blueprint of harmony, revealing that peace between humanity and creation is not an unrealistic ideal, but an original design, and that life was meant to be lived in balance, connection, and care, sustained by abundance, enriched by beauty, and grounded in an unbroken relationship with the Creator and the world entrusted to human stewardship.
The trees of destiny stand at the heart of the garden as profound symbols of purpose, choice, and relationship, shaping human existence not through force but through invitation. For in the midst of abundance, God placed two trees that defined meaning rather than necessity, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. neither hidden nor guarded by fear, but openly present, accessible, and significant, revealing that humanity was created not for instinct alone, but for conscious engagement with freedom. The tree of life represented ongoing vitality, sustained existence, and uninterrupted communion with God, a living sign that life was not self-sustaining, but continually received, rooted in relationship rather than independence. And as long as humanity lived in trust, life flowed freely, unbroken and unforced, without anxiety over survival or loss, because life itself was a gift continually renewed rather than a possession to be secured. In contrast, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil stood as a boundary rather than a trap, a marker that defined moral space and responsibility, indicating that while humanity was free to enjoy the fullness of creation, freedom itself required limits to remain life-giving, and that knowledge, when severed from trust, could become destructive rather than enlightening. This tree did not exist to withhold goodness, but to preserve relationship, for obedience was not demanded as proof of loyalty, but offered as a pathway to continued harmony, showing that trust precedes understanding and that life flourishes when confidence in God guides human choice. The presence of the forbidden tree reveals that humanity was never meant to exist as an automaton, blindly compliant or constrained by ignorance, but as a moral being capable of choice, discernment, and consequence. And this capacity elevated human existence beyond survival into responsibility, where decisions mattered not only practically but relationally. Freedom in the garden was therefore expansive, not narrow, framed by abundance rather than restriction, as humanity was permitted to eat from every tree of the garden except one, making the boundary small in comparison to the generosity surrounding it. And this imbalance underscores that God's posture toward humanity was one of trust and generosity rather than control, offering far more freedom than limitation. The tree of knowledge also clarifies that not all knowledge is neutral, and that timing, context, and relationship determine whether knowledge leads to wisdom or fracture. For to know good and evil apart from God is to claim moral autonomy, shifting authority from trust to self-definition. And this shift, though subtle, carries profound consequences for identity and relationship. The boundary set by God was therefore an act of care rather than restriction, protecting humanity from bearing a weight it was not meant to carry, preserving innocence and sustaining dependence. And within this boundary, freedom could be enjoyed without fear, guilt, or alienation. The coexistence of both trees reveals a tension built into human existence from the beginning, a tension between life received and life seized, between trust and self-determination, between freedom exercised within relationship and freedom claimed apart from it. And this tension defines the human story as one shaped by choice rather than fate. The tree of life affirms that existence is meant to be sustained through connection, not independence, and that life flourishes when rooted in trust and communion, while the tree of knowledge warns that autonomy pursued without reference to God fractures harmony and introduces separation, not because God withholds life, but because life is structured to flow through relationship rather than self-assertion. Freedom in Eden was therefore not absolute autonomy, but relational liberty, the freedom to live fully within the framework of trust, and boundaries were not barriers to joy, but safeguards of it, ensuring that freedom remained oriented toward life rather than isolation. The trees also reveal that God did not coerce obedience through threat or surveillance, but entrusted humanity with choice, allowing love and trust to exist genuinely rather than by force. And this trust dignified humanity, treating them as capable partners rather than controlled subjects. The placement of the trees at the center of the garden indicates that choice was central, not peripheral, to human existence, and that moral responsibility was not an afterthought, but foundational, woven into the fabric of life itself. The tree of knowledge also demonstrates that obedience is meaningful only when disobedience is possible, and that faith is genuine only when alternatives exist, making freedom essential to authentic relationship. The trees of destiny therefore stand not as symbols of arbitrary command, but as expressions of divine respect for human agency, revealing a creator who values relationship over control and trust over compulsion. The invitation to choose life through trust rather than knowledge through autonomy frames freedom as a gift that must be stewarded, not exploited. And this framing challenges the assumption that freedom means the absence of limits, instead presenting freedom as the ability to live rightly within a meaningful structure. The tragedy implicit in these trees is not that one was forbidden, but that humanity would later misunderstand the nature of freedom, confusing independence with fulfillment and autonomy with wisdom, and this misunderstanding would fracture the harmony the garden embodied. Yet even in their placement, the trees affirm that humanity was created capable of moral reasoning, ethical responsibility, and relational trust, bearing a dignity that comes with choice and consequence. The tree of life and the tree of knowledge together reveal that human destiny was never predetermined by instinct or survival, but shaped by decisions rooted in trust or self-rule, and that boundaries are not enemies of freedom, but its necessary framework, ensuring that life remains connected, meaningful, and whole. In this way, the trees of destiny stand as enduring symbols of human freedom, responsibility, and relationship, reminding humanity that true life is not found in seizing control, but in receiving life through trust, honoring boundaries as expressions of care, and choosing freedom that leads not to isolation, but to communion, harmony, and sustained life within the design of the Creator.
The first temptation unfolds quietly rather than violently, entering the story not through force or threat, but through suggestion, subtlety, and distortion. As the serpent appears within the harmony of the garden, not as a terrifying intruder, but as a cunning presence, described as more crafty than any other creature, indicating intelligence bent toward manipulation rather than creation. And this introduction signals that the greatest dangers to human flourishing often arise not from obvious evil, but from deceptive reasoning that sounds plausible, appealing, and familiar. The serpent does not deny God outright, nor does it command disobedience directly, but instead begins by questioning, planting uncertainty through a carefully framed inquiry that shifts attention away from abundance toward restriction, asking whether God truly said that humans could not eat from any tree in the garden, subtly exaggerating the boundary to make God appear withholding rather than generous. And in doing so, the serpent reframes reality, inviting humanity to see God not as a provider, but as a limiter of freedom. This question is not innocent curiosity, but strategic doubt, designed to loosen trust by introducing suspicion, because once God's word becomes questionable, relationship becomes fragile, and certainty begins to erode. The temptation works by redirecting focus, drawing attention away from the overwhelming freedom and abundance of the garden toward the single prohibition, transforming a small boundary into a perceived injustice. And this shift reveals how desire can be reshaped by perception, how gratitude can be replaced by grievance, and how freedom can feel constrained when trust is weakened. The serpent's method exposes the anatomy of temptation itself, showing that it rarely begins with outright rebellion, but with reinterpretation, subtly altering what God has said until obedience appears unreasonable and doubt seems rational. As the conversation continues, the serpent escalates from questioning to contradiction, asserting that disobedience will not lead to death, but to enlightenment, reframing God's warning as deception and presenting autonomy as empowerment, suggesting that God's command is motivated by self-interest rather than care. And this accusation strikes at the heart of trust, because it portrays God not as a giver of life, but as a rival guarding power.
In this moment, temptation becomes not merely about eating fruit, but about redefining reality, authority, and identity, inviting humanity to see themselves not as dependent recipients of life, but as potential equals to God, capable of determining good and evil on their own terms. Desire enters the story not as hunger, but as longing for more knowledge, more autonomy, more control. And this desire is not inherently evil, because the desire to grow, understand, and become is part of human nature. But when desire detaches from trust and order, it becomes distorted, reaching for fulfillment outside the boundaries that preserve life. Doubt and desire intertwine, feeding one another, as uncertainty about God's intentions fuels longing for independence, and longing for independence deepens doubt about the necessity of obedience, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that gradually shifts the center of authority from God to the self. The serpent's temptation succeeds not by introducing something entirely new, but by twisting what already exists, taking humanity's capacity for reasoning, curiosity, and aspiration, and redirecting them towards self-rule rather than relationship. And this redirection reveals that temptation often disguises itself as progress, framing disobedience as growth and restraint as limitation. The first temptation also exposes the vulnerability inherent in freedom, because beings capable of choice are also capable of deception, and genuine freedom always carries the risk of misuse. Yet this risk does not negate freedom's value, but underscores its seriousness, showing that choice is meaningful precisely because it can alter the course of relationship and consequence. Questioning God becomes the turning point, because once trust in God's word is undermined, boundaries lose their meaning, warnings lose their weight, and desire becomes the primary guide. And this shift illustrates how temptation reorders priorities, elevating personal perception above divine instruction. The serpent's promise that knowledge will bring godlike status appeals to pride, suggesting that dependence is weakness and autonomy is strength. Yet this promise conceals the cost, because knowledge gained apart from trust fractures innocence and introduces alienation, not empowerment. And this concealment is central to temptation's power, as it highlights perceived benefits while obscuring consequences. Doubt also isolates, drawing humanity inward, encouraging reliance on personal judgment alone rather than shared trust. And this inward turn marks the beginning of separation, not yet enacted, but already conceived in the heart, as relationship gives way to self-centered reasoning. The first temptation reveals that evil does not need to destroy goodness outright, but only to distort it slightly, bending truth just enough to redirect action. And this distortion thrives where vigilance weakens and trust erodes. The serpent's success lies in making disobedience appear reasonable, even necessary, framing it as the next logical step in human development rather than a breach of relationship. And this framing resonates because it aligns with human desire for growth while disconnecting that growth from its intended source. Desire, once awakened and detached from trust, becomes restless, unsatisfied with what is given, always seeking more. And doubt provides justification for acting on that desire, forming a partnership that undermines contentment and reshapes values. The first temptation, therefore, establishes a pattern that echoes throughout human experience, showing how questioning God's goodness leads to reinterpreting His commands, how doubt invites desire to exceed its bounds, and how freedom, when divorced from trust, becomes vulnerability rather than strength. Yet this moment also underscores the seriousness with which humanity was created, because temptation is meaningful only where choice exists, and choice exists only where dignity and responsibility are present, affirming that humanity's fallibility does not negate its worth, but reveals the weight of its calling. The serpent, questioning, desire, and doubt converge, not as overwhelming forces, but as quiet influences, reminding us that the most transformative moments often arise not from dramatic confrontation, but from subtle shifts in belief, and that the path away from harmony begins not with action, but with altered trust. The first temptation thus stands as a warning and a mirror, revealing how easily trust can be compromised, how desire can be misdirected, and how doubt can masquerade as insight, showing that the battle for human flourishing is fought not only in actions, but in perceptions, interpretations, and the choice of whom to trust. And it leaves humanity at a crossroads where freedom must decide whether it will remain anchored in relationship or drift toward self-defined autonomy, a decision whose consequences will reshape the world that follows.
The fall unfolds as a moment of tragic simplicity, where a single act carries consequences far beyond its immediate appearance as humanity eats the fruit not out of hunger, but out of choice, crossing a boundary that had been clearly defined, and in doing so transforms freedom into fracture. Because the act itself is quiet, almost ordinary, yet its significance is immense, marking the point where trust gives way to self-determination and obedience yields to desire, and the eating of the fruit becomes the physical expression of an inward decision already formed through doubt. This act is not forced, nor rushed, nor compelled by need, but chosen, revealing that the fall begins not in weakness, but in misdirected will, as humanity reaches for knowledge apart from relationship, seeking wisdom without trust and autonomy without dependence. And in that moment, the harmony that defined life in the garden is disrupted, not because God withdraws goodness, but because humanity steps outside the structure that sustained it. Immediately, awareness floods in, not as enlightenment, but as exposure, and the first realization is nakedness, a sudden consciousness of vulnerability that had not existed before, for nakedness itself had not changed, but perception had, and where there was once innocence without self-consciousness, there is now self-awareness laced with discomfort, as humanity begins to see itself not only as known, but as exposed, not only as present, but as fragile. This awareness is not merely physical, but existential, signaling a shift in how humans relate to themselves and one another, as the ease of being fully seen is replaced by the impulse to cover, conceal, and protect. And this marks the birth of shame, not as guilt for a specific act alone, but as a deeper sense that something is wrong within, that the self is no longer safe to present openly. Fear enters alongside shame as humanity's perception of God also changes, for the Creator who once represented life, presence, and belonging now appears as a threat, and this distorted perception drives humanity to hide, not because God has become hostile, but because trust has been broken, and without trust, even love can feel dangerous. Fear reshapes reality, turning the garden from a sanctuary into a place of concealment and transforming divine presence from comfort into anxiety as humanity retreats among the trees, attempting to escape visibility, illustrating that separation from God begins not with distance imposed from above, but with withdrawal chosen from below. Shame and fear work together, feeding one another, as shame convinces humanity that it must hide, and fear convinces it that exposure will bring harm, creating a cycle that fractures relationship, isolates the self, and disrupts the openness that once defined life. The awareness gained through eating the fruit does not elevate humanity as promised, but burdens it, introducing knowledge without wisdom, discernment without peace, and self-awareness without security. And this knowledge cannot be undone, because once innocence is lost, it cannot be reclaimed through effort or denial. The fall also introduces blame as a defense against shame, as humanity seeks to redirect responsibility rather than confront vulnerability, revealing how fear drives the need to justify, explain, and distance oneself from guilt. And this impulse further fractures relationships, turning unity into division and partnership into accusation. Fear of God replaces trust in God, and obedience shifts from a joyful alignment to a fearful obligation, as humanity's inner orientation changes, redefining how it understands authority, presence, and accountability. The fall does not immediately destroy the world, but it distorts every relationship within it, creating dissonance between humanity and God, humanity and itself, humanity and others, and humanity and creation. And this distortion introduces struggle where there was once harmony, resistance where there was once cooperation, and anxiety where there was once peace. Shame reshapes identity, convincing humanity that it is no longer simply a creature loved and sustained, but a being that must manage perception, protect itself, and secure its own worth. And this shift marks the beginning of self-reliance rooted in fear rather than confidence rooted in trust. The act of eating the fruit also reveals that disobedience is never isolated because it alters perception, desire, and relationships simultaneously, and its consequences ripple outward, affecting not only the one who acts, but the world in which they live, as internal fracture becomes external disorder. Fear becomes the lens through which reality is interpreted, leading humanity to assume hostility where there is concern, judgment where there is pursuit, and threat where there is invitation. And this misinterpretation deepens separation, making reconciliation feel unsafe even when it is offered. The fall, therefore, is not merely the breaking of a rule, but the breaking of alignment, the moment when humanity's inner compass shifts away from trust and towards self-preservation, redefining freedom as independence rather than relationship, and wisdom as control rather than obedience. Awareness of nakedness symbolizes this shift powerfully as humanity becomes conscious not only of the body but of vulnerability itself, recognizing dependence yet rejecting it and attempting to resolve exposure through concealment rather than through restored trust. Fear and shame together create a new internal landscape, one marked by anxiety, defensiveness, and withdrawal, where openness feels risky and relationship feels conditional. And this internal change becomes the seed of all subsequent brokenness in human experience. Yet even within this moment of failure, the fall also reveals the depth of human significance, because the weight of the consequence reflects the importance of the role humanity holds, showing that choices matter precisely because they shape reality, relationship, and identity. The fall stands as a turning point where humanity moves from innocence to experience, from harmony to fracture, and from trust to fear. And while the immediate result is loss, the deeper tragedy lies in the misalignment of perception as humanity begins to see itself as alone, exposed, and threatened in a world that was once secure. Eating the fruit alters not only what humanity knows, but how it knows, replacing relational understanding with self-centered judgment, and this altered way of knowing ensures that fear and shame will linger long after the moment has passed, shaping generations to come. The fall, therefore, is not a single misstep, but the birth of a fractured condition where freedom remains, but trust is wounded, where awareness remains, but peace is lost, and where humanity must now navigate life burdened by fear and shame, longing for restoration of the harmony that was once natural, and carrying within itself the memory of innocence, even as it lives in the reality of its loss.
God seeking humanity after the fall reveals a profound truth about divine character, because the first movement after disobedience is not abandonment, but pursuit, not silence, but a question, as God enters the garden and calls out, "Where are you?" A question not asked for information, but for invitation, relationship, and self-recognition. For God already knows humanity's physical location, yet He asks in order to draw them out of hiding, to give voice to separation, and to invite acknowledgement rather than concealment. This question exposes the relational fracture caused by fear and shame, because humanity's response reveals distance not in geography, but in trust, as they emerge hesitantly, confessing fear rather than wrongdoing, showing that the deepest wound of the fall is not rule-breaking alone, but the transformation of how humans perceive God, no longer as a safe presence, but as a source of threat. God's seeking highlights that separation is not God's desire, but humanity's response, for hiding is chosen by humans, not imposed by God. And this distinction matters deeply because it shows that even after disobedience, God remains oriented toward restoration rather than rejection.
Where Are You also invites humanity to locate itself existentially, to recognize the internal shift that has occurred, acknowledging that something fundamental has changed and that relationship has been disrupted, not by God's withdrawal, but by human fear. When humanity responds, blame emerges immediately, revealing how broken trust reshapes behavior, as the man deflects responsibility onto the woman and indirectly onto God himself forgiving her, while the woman redirects blame toward the serpent. And this cascade of accusation demonstrates how fear fractures unity, turning partners into adversaries and relationships into shields against accountability. Blame becomes a mechanism of self-preservation, an attempt to escape vulnerability by dispersing responsibility. And this impulse reveals how deeply trust has eroded, because where trust once allowed openness and honesty, fear now demands defense and justification. Broken trust distorts communication, making confession feel dangerous and accountability feel threatening. And this distortion extends beyond human relationships into the divine-human relationship, as humanity struggles to stand honestly before God. God's response to blame is neither dismissal nor indulgence, but discernment, as he addresses each party directly, acknowledging actions and consequences without collapsing into rage or silence, revealing a justice that is measured, personal, and relational rather than arbitrary. Judgment enters the story not as sudden wrath, but as the naming of reality, as God articulates the consequences that now flow naturally from broken trust, disrupted harmony, and misaligned desire. And this judgment is not punitive alone, but descriptive, revealing how the world will now operate under fracture, with pain, struggle, resistance, and mortality becoming part of human experience. Yet, even within judgment, mercy is present, woven quietly into God's actions and words, because humanity is not destroyed, not erased, not abandoned, but allowed to continue, to live, to bear children, to work the ground, and to remain under God's watchful care, showing that judgment serves containment and correction rather than annihilation. God's question and subsequent engagement demonstrate that divine justice does not eliminate relationship, but seeks to preserve it within new conditions, acknowledging the seriousness of disobedience while refusing to sever connection. Mercy appears not as denial of consequence, but restraint within it, as God limits the reach of destruction and preserves life even as harmony is altered. And this balance reveals that mercy and justice are not opposing forces, but integrated expressions of care. The act of God seeking humanity also affirms human worth even in failure, because pursuit implies value, and the willingness to question, listen, and respond affirms that humanity is still regarded as relationally significant, not disposable, despite broken trust. Where Are You continues to echo beyond the garden as a recurring divine posture towards humanity, a call not meant to condemn, but to awaken awareness, to invite return, and to initiate restoration, even when fear and shame persist. The presence of judgment also affirms moral reality, because a world without consequence would empty choice of meaning, but a world with consequence tempered by mercy preserves dignity while acknowledging responsibility. God's engagement with humanity after the fall establishes a pattern in which justice names the truth of brokenness, while mercy sustains the possibility of future hope, ensuring that failure does not have the final word. Blame and broken trust reveal humanity's instinct to protect itself at the cost of relationship, yet God's response models a different way, confronting truth without cruelty and holding individuals accountable without erasing compassion. Even as God describes pain, toil, and loss, his continued presence signals that relationship endures, though altered, and that humanity's story will continue under guidance rather than abandonment.
The seeking God reframes the fall not as the end of divine involvement, but as the beginning of a more complex relationship, one that must now navigate fear, consequence, and hope together. And this reframing is crucial because it shows that divine love is not contingent on human perfection, but persistent even in failure. Mercy is further revealed in God's provision, as humanity is not sent away exposed, but cared for, indicating that even judgment is accompanied by compassion that meets immediate need. And this care reinforces that God's justice is restorative rather than vindictive. Where are you thus becomes the threshold between fracture and hope, a moment where humanity stands exposed yet not abandoned, confronted yet not destroyed, and accountable yet still invited into relationship. The mixture of judgment and mercy establishes the moral framework of the world moving forward, where actions matter, consequences exist, and grace remains active, shaping a reality in which humanity must live with the weight of choice, but not without the presence of God.
Life outside the garden begins not with chaos or immediate destruction, but with a heavy, sobering transition as humanity steps beyond Eden, carrying with them the weight of altered reality, where harmony gives way to struggle and ease is replaced by effort. And this departure marks the beginning of life shaped by pain, labor, and mortality, realities that were not part of the original design, but now become woven into daily existence as a consequence of broken trust. Pain enters human experience not as cruelty imposed arbitrarily, but as a reflection of fracture, revealing that relationships, bodies, and the world itself no longer operate in effortless alignment. And this pain touches every dimension of life, from childbirth to work, from relationships to inner struggle, signaling that creation itself now resists rather than cooperates, and that effort will replace ease in the pursuit of sustenance, growth, and survival. Labor, once meaningful and fulfilling within the garden, now becomes toil, marked by sweat, fatigue, and resistance, as the ground that once yielded freely now demands persistence and endurance, teaching humanity that provision will come through perseverance rather than abundance alone. And this shift transforms work into both a burden and a necessity, shaping identity, rhythm, and survival across generations. Mortality also emerges clearly into human awareness, not merely as eventual physical death, but as a constant presence shaping how life is understood, introducing limitation, urgency, and vulnerability, reminding humanity that time is finite, strength fades, and existence must now be navigated with awareness of an ending. And this awareness reshapes values, priorities, and meaning as humans begin to measure life not only by fullness, but by fragility. Leaving Eden is not simply a change of location, but a profound separation from a state of being, as humanity exits a space defined by immediate divine presence and effortless provision, and enters a world where God feels more distant, where survival requires intention, and where fear and uncertainty accompany each step forward. The act of leaving is filled with sorrow, not only because of loss, but because memory remains, and humanity carries within itself an awareness of what life once was, creating a longing that will persist across history, a deep sense that the world is not as it should be, and that something precious has been left behind. The garden's gate becomes a symbol of separation, not merely barring access to a place, but marking the boundary between innocence and experience, between harmony and struggle, and between life sustained freely and life sustained through effort. Pain and labor begin to define the human story outside Eden, yet they do not erase meaning, because even within toil there remains purpose, and even within suffering there remains connection, as humanity continues to bear children, cultivate land, build communities, and seek relationship, showing that life, though altered, is not extinguished.
Mortality adds weight to every moment, transforming ordinary experiences into precious ones, because what ends gains significance through its impermanence. And this awareness, though born of loss, also deepens love, responsibility, and care, as humans learn that what is temporary must be valued while it lasts. Sorrow accompanies the departure from Eden, yet it is not without hope, because embedded within judgment is a quiet promise, a hint that the fracture will not be the final word, and this hint appears not as immediate restoration, but as assurance that life will continue, that humanity will not be abandoned to despair, and that meaning persists even outside the garden. Hope is subtle, woven into the continuation of life itself, and to the birth of future generations, into the endurance of relationship, and into God's ongoing involvement with humanity, even if that involvement now unfolds through distance rather than direct presence. Sorrow and hope coexist, shaping a human condition marked by tension, where grief over loss lives alongside resilience, and where longing for restoration fuels creativity, faith, and perseverance. Life outside the garden becomes a journey rather than a dwelling, marked by movement, effort, and uncertainty. Yet this journey also opens the possibility of growth, learning, and transformation, as humanity navigates a world that resists yet still provides, challenges yet still sustains. Pain teaches limits, labor teaches persistence, and mortality teaches humility, reshaping humanity's understanding of itself and its place in the world, grounding ambition within fragility and power within dependence. Leaving Eden also marks the beginning of history as struggle, where choices carry heavier consequences and relationships require greater effort. Yet it is within this struggle that humanity's capacity for courage, compassion, and hope begins to emerge, revealing that even fractured existence can produce meaning. The sorrow of exile is therefore not empty despair, but grieving infused with expectation, because the memory of Eden becomes a reference point, a reminder that the world was once whole and may one day be restored. And this memory fuels hope, not as naive optimism, but as deep-seated conviction that brokenness is not original nor ultimate. Life outside the garden is harder, slower, and more uncertain, but it is not devoid of purpose, as God remains present though less visible, guiding humanity through consequence rather than isolation, and sustaining existence through provision rather than abundance alone. Hope, hinted in sorrow, becomes a quiet force shaping human history, encouraging endurance, faith, and the pursuit of restoration, even when the path is unclear. And this hope ensures that exile does not become annihilation, that pain does not erase meaning, and that mortality does not negate value. The departure from Eden thus defines the human story as one lived between loss and longing, between toil and hope, where suffering is real and unavoidable, yet never without the possibility of redemption, and where humanity, though removed from the garden, continues forward, carrying both the burden of consequence and the promise that life, though altered, still holds meaning, direction, and the quiet assurance that sorrow will not have the final word.
The story of the first brothers unfolds as the earliest portrait of human relationships outside the garden, revealing how life shaped by loss, labor, and longing quickly becomes a stage for both devotion and division, as Cain and Abel grow up in a world already marked by fracture, yet still oriented toward God, each expressing worship through the work of their hands, Cain as a cultivator of the ground, and Abel as a keeper of flocks, showing that even after exile, humanity continues to seek connection with the divine through offering, gratitude, and acknowledgement.
Worship emerges here not as ritual imposed from above, but as a natural human impulse, an attempt to respond to God within a changed world. And both brothers bring offerings that reflect their labor and identity, suggesting sincerity of effort rather than indifference. Yet the moment that should have unified them becomes the seed of division, as God regards Abel's offering but does not regard Cain's in the same way, a distinction that Scripture presents without elaborate explanation, inviting reflection not on favoritism but on posture, intention, and trust. And this ambiguity itself becomes significant because Cain's response reveals more about his heart than the evaluation of the offering itself. Jealousy enters quietly but powerfully as Cain's anger rises not toward God directly but toward his brother, transforming worship into comparison and devotion into resentment. And this shift reveals how easily identity becomes threatened when worth is measured relationally rather than relationally rooted, as Cain interprets God's response not as invitation to reflection but as personal rejection, allowing perceived inequality to erode trust. Jealousy distorts vision, narrowing focus until the abundance of life and opportunity fades into a single grievance, and Cain's face falls, signaling an inward collapse where disappointment hardens into bitterness, and bitterness begins to define perception. God's response to Cain is marked by mercy and engagement rather than immediate judgment, as he speaks directly to him, naming the anger, questioning the internal state, and warning of the danger that lies ahead, saying that sin is crouching at the door, desiring to rule, but that Cain must rule over it. And this warning reveals a crucial truth about human agency, that even in a fallen world, desire does not eliminate responsibility, and emotion does not excuse action. God's warning frames sin not as an irresistible force, but as a predatory presence that waits for consent, emphasizing that humanity still possesses the capacity to choose restraint over impulse, and that mastery over destructive desire remains possible even amid disappointment. The warning also shows that God does not abandon humanity to internal struggle, but actively intervenes, offering insight before catastrophe rather than condemnation after it. And this intervention affirms that God's justice is preventative as well as responsive, oriented toward preservation rather than punishment. Yet Cain's jealousy continues to grow unchecked, feeding on silence and inward rumination, as resentment festers without confession or release, illustrating how unaddressed emotion can evolve into intention and how comparison, when allowed to dominate, transforms relationship into rivalry. The relationship between the brothers becomes strained not by competition alone, but by isolation, as Cain turns inward rather than upward, withdrawing from dialogue with God and failing to receive the warning as guidance. And this withdrawal marks a critical step toward violence, because isolation amplifies distortion and removes corrective perspective. Worship, which should have anchored Cain in humility and gratitude, becomes instead a trigger for envy, revealing how spiritual practices themselves can be corrupted when identity is rooted in recognition rather than relationship. Abel, by contrast, remains largely silent in the narrative, emphasizing that the focus is not on his virtue as comparison, but on Cain's internal struggle. And this silence underscores that jealousy does not require provocation from the other, but arises from within when desire turns inward and trust erodes. The first brothers thus embody the earliest manifestation of relational fracture beyond Eden, showing how broken trust with God quickly extends to broken trust with others, and how unresolved emotion can escalate into destructive action.
God's warning stands as a pivotal moment, a threshold where tragedy could have been avoided, demonstrating that the path toward harm is not inevitable but chosen, and that divine guidance remains present even in moments of intense emotion. The language of sin crouching like a predator conveys urgency, suggesting that destructive impulses grow stronger when ignored, and that vigilance is required not only against external threats, but against internal distortions of desire and perception. Cain's struggle illustrates that the greatest battles often occur within, where identity, worth, and recognition collide, and where jealousy can quietly reshape values until harm feels justified. The story of the first brothers therefore reveals that violence does not erupt suddenly, but develops through stages of comparison, resentment, isolation, and ignored warning, forming a progression that begins in worship and ends in rupture. God's engagement with Cain before any act of violence also affirms that divine justice seeks prevention rather than mere punishment, offering clarity, choice, and responsibility even when emotion runs high. The tragedy implicit in this story is not only the harm that will follow, but the missed opportunity for transformation, as Cain is invited to master his desire rather than be mastered by it. And this invitation reveals the dignity still afforded to humanity, even when broken, because responsibility implies value and capability. The first brothers thus stand as a mirror for the human condition, reflecting how quickly devotion can turn into rivalry when identity becomes fragile, and how jealousy, when left unchecked, undermines both worship and relationship. The warning given to Cain echoes beyond this moment as a universal truth, reminding humanity that desire itself is not evil, but when it seeks control rather than alignment, it becomes destructive, and that mastery over impulse is central to preserving life, relationship, and community. The story leaves the listener suspended between warning and consequence, emphasizing that the fracture introduced outside the garden continues to unfold through human choices, and that the earliest family already bears the marks of a world struggling to live rightly within brokenness, where worship, jealousy, and divine warning intersect, revealing both the danger of unchecked desire and the enduring presence of a God who speaks before destruction, invites responsibility, and seeks to guide humanity away from the path that leads to irreversible loss.
The first murder marks a devastating escalation in the human story, where inner turmoil gives way to irreversible action, and the fracture that began with disobedience now manifests as violence against another human being, as Cain's unchecked rage moves from inward resentment to outward destruction, revealing how sin, when ignored and nurtured, seeks expression through harm. The act itself is stark and unembellished, as Cain rises against his brother Abel in the field and kills him, transforming rivalry into bloodshed and turning the soil, once a source of life and sustenance, into a silent witness to death. And this simplicity underscores the horror of the moment, because violence does not require complexity to devastate, only the surrender of restraint. Rage fuels the act, a rage born not merely of jealousy, but of wounded identity, unmet expectation, and the refusal to confront inner brokenness, showing that violence often erupts when emotion is allowed to define reality unchecked, and when anger becomes a justification rather than a warning. Abel's death represents the first loss of human life at the hands of another, a moment where the value of bearing God's image is violated, and this act reshapes the world permanently, introducing a new dimension of evil that goes beyond disobedience into the destruction of relationship itself. The aftermath reveals that violence does not end with the act, because blood cries from the ground, a powerful image that personifies creation itself as responding to injustice, suggesting that the world is morally attuned, that wrongs leave an imprint beyond human awareness, and that violence cannot be hidden or contained, no matter how isolated the act may seem. The ground, which had already been cursed to resist human labor, now becomes further burdened, absorbing blood that testifies against the one who shed it, indicating that sin fractures not only human relationships, but the relationship between humanity and creation, deepening alienation and resistance. God's response again begins not with immediate condemnation, but with a question, "Where is your brother?" inviting acknowledgement and responsibility, yet Cain responds with denial and deflection, claiming ignorance and rejecting accountability with the question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And this response exposes how violence hardens the heart, diminishing empathy and severing the sense of responsibility toward others, as Cain refuses to recognize relational obligation. The question of brotherhood becomes central here, because the murder is not merely the taking of life, but the rejection of responsibility for another, marking a profound moral collapse where self-interest overrides communal care. God's reply reveals that denial cannot silence truth, as Abel's blood cries out, making clear that sin cannot be concealed by words or distance, and that consequences are not arbitrary punishments, but responses to reality itself. The consequences of sin now intensify as Cain is cursed from the ground, no longer able to draw life from it as before, becoming a restless wanderer, alienated not only from family, but from place, stability, and identity. And this punishment reflects the nature of his act, as one who disrupted life is now cut off from its source, forced into instability that mirrors his inner fragmentation. Yet even here, mercy persists alongside judgment, as Cain's life is spared and a mark is placed upon him to protect him from vengeance, revealing that divine justice does not mirror human violence, and that restraint remains a defining feature of God's response, preventing the cycle of retribution from escalating unchecked. The mark signifies that while sin carries consequence, life is still valued, and that punishment aims to contain harm rather than perpetuate it, drawing boundaries around violence even as it acknowledges its severity. Cain's fear that others will kill him reflects a new awareness of a violent world, where the act he committed becomes a lens through which he now perceives reality, suggesting that violence breeds fear, and that those who harm others come to expect harm in return, reshaping their understanding of safety and trust. The first murder thus introduces a grim reciprocity, where violence generates anxiety, isolation, and instability, not power or security, dismantling any illusion that harm can bring resolution or satisfaction. The story also reveals that sin compounds, as Cain's initial resentment leads to murder, and murder leads to deeper alienation, illustrating how destructive choices rarely resolve internal conflict, but instead amplify it, extending their impact across relationships and environments. Blood crying from the ground symbolizes the persistence of injustice, affirming that wrongs demand reckoning, that suffering leaves a voice even when victims are silenced, and that creation itself participates in bearing witness to moral truth. The consequences of sin, therefore, are not limited to punishment imposed from outside, but unfold naturally from the act itself, altering identity, relationships, environment, and future. And this unfolding reveals that freedom misused does not eliminate responsibility, but deepens it. Cain's story stands as a sobering lesson on the trajectory of unchecked emotion, ignored warning, and distorted desire, showing how sin progresses from thought to action to consequence, and how early intervention, had it been received, might have altered the outcome.
The first murder also expands the human understanding of loss, as death becomes not only an abstract concept, but a lived reality that fractures families and reshapes memory, introducing grief that cannot be undone and absence that cannot be repaired. Abel's silent presence in the narrative after his death emphasizes the irreversibility of violence, reminding us that once life is taken, restoration in this world is impossible, and that the cost of sin includes permanent loss alongside ongoing consequence. Yet even in this darkness, the continued engagement of God signals that humanity is not abandoned, that accountability persists alongside mercy, and that the story of sin, though deepening, is not the end of the human story. The first murder therefore stands as a turning point where the potential for violence becomes actualized, revealing the destructive power of rage when it overrules responsibility, the far-reaching consequences of sin when it moves from heart to hand, and the enduring truth that life is sacred, that violence echoes beyond the moment, and that even in judgment, God seeks to restrain destruction, preserve life, and confront humanity with the weight of its choices as the fractured world continues to unfold.
As the world continues beyond the first act of violence, humanity does not come to a halt, but instead expands rapidly, revealing that growth and brokenness advance side by side as families multiply, communities form, and the foundations of civilization begin to take shape in a world already marked by fracture, showing that human creativity and capacity for development remain intact even as moral clarity begins to erode. Descendants spread across the land, establishing lineages that carry memory, skill, and culture, and with them comes the emergence of cities, spaces of collective living where protection, cooperation, and identity are forged, reflecting humanity's deep need for belonging and stability in a world no longer defined by effortless harmony. Cities arise not merely as shelters, but as symbols of permanence, ambition, and legacy. Places where human ingenuity is concentrated and where shared systems of labor, governance, and culture take form, demonstrating that even outside Eden, humanity retains the drive to build, organize, and shape its environment. Within these growing communities, advancements flourish as people develop tools, music, agriculture, and craftsmanship, marking the early rise of civilization through innovation and specialization. And these developments highlight that creativity itself is not diminished by the fall, but continues as an expression of the image of God, though now operating within a fractured moral landscape. Yet alongside this progress, a subtle and dangerous shift takes place as moral decline begins to accompany cultural advancement, revealing that technological or societal growth does not automatically produce ethical maturity, and that skill can increase even as conscience weakens. Families, once the primary space of shared trust and responsibility, begin to reflect the same fractures seen in earlier relationships, as power dynamics, rivalry, and self-interest creep into generational patterns, demonstrating how brokenness is transmitted not only through actions, but through culture, habit, and example. The rise of cities brings both protection and concentration of influence, allowing ideas, values, and behaviors to spread more rapidly. And this acceleration amplifies both good and evil, making virtue and vice more impactful and more visible within communal life. Moral decline does not arrive suddenly, but develops gradually, through small compromises normalized over time, as violence, pride, and self-exaltation become increasingly tolerated, and as the memory of dependence on God fades into the background of daily survival and achievement.
One of the most striking features of this growing world is the emergence of boasting and vengeance as values, where power is measured by dominance rather than responsibility, and where personal injury becomes justification for excessive retaliation, revealing how justice begins to distort into self-protection and pride replaces humility. The progression from garden to city illustrates a shift from stewardship to self-reliance, where humanity increasingly seeks security in structures it builds rather than in relationship with God. And this shift reshapes identity, as success becomes defined by expansion, control, and legacy rather than trust and obedience. Civilization rising also brings complexity, as social structures create distance between individuals and the consequences of their actions, allowing wrongdoing to feel abstract rather than personal, and enabling moral responsibility to diffuse across systems rather than rest on individuals alone. As communities grow, accountability weakens, and behaviors once recognized as destructive become embedded within culture, reinforced by collective acceptance rather than challenged by conscience. The world becomes louder, busier, and more advanced, yet increasingly disconnected from its moral center, illustrating that progress without alignment leads not to restoration, but to deeper fragmentation. Despite this decline, humanity continues to bear children, create art, and cultivate land, revealing a tension that defines this era, where life persists and even flourishes outwardly, while inward integrity erodes, creating a world that appears strong but is internally unstable. Families pass down not only skills and stories, but also unresolved brokenness, shaping generations that inherit both creativity and corruption. And this inheritance accelerates the spread of moral decline, making it systemic rather than isolated. The growing world demonstrates that sin does not eliminate human potential, but redirects it, using intelligence, organization, and strength in service of self-interest rather than shared good. And this redirection magnifies harm because it operates through sophisticated means rather than raw impulse alone. Cities become monuments to human ambition, reflecting both resilience and rebellion, places where humanity attempts to establish permanence in a world marked by mortality, seeking meaning through legacy rather than relationship. Moral decline is evident not only in acts of violence, but in attitudes, as reverence gives way to self-glorification, restraint to excess, and gratitude to entitlement, signaling a deeper erosion of values that once grounded human life. Yet even as decline spreads, the story does not suggest that humanity becomes entirely devoid of goodness, but rather that goodness becomes harder to sustain, overshadowed by systems and desires that prioritize power and survival over trust and responsibility. The growing world thus becomes a paradox, marked by impressive development and deepening moral confusion, where civilization advances but wisdom lags behind, and where human capacity outpaces human restraint. This stage of the story reveals that the core problem facing humanity is not lack of ability, but misalignment of purpose, as skills increase without corresponding moral anchoring, leading to societies that are capable yet unstable, advanced yet ethically adrift. The rise of families and cities shows that humanity cannot return to Eden through progress alone, because building outward does not heal inward fracture, and expanding influence does not restore trust. Moral decline, therefore, is not the absence of culture, but its corruption of it, not the end of community, but its distortion. And this decline sets the stage for further consequence, as a world filled with people, structures, and achievements becomes increasingly resistant to guidance, humility, and correction.
The growing world stands as a testament to humanity's resilience and ingenuity, but also as a warning that civilization without moral grounding amplifies brokenness rather than resolving it, revealing a trajectory where expansion continues even as integrity diminishes, and where the need for intervention becomes increasingly clear as humanity moves further from the harmony of its origin while carrying forward the longing for meaning, stability, and restoration in a world that grows larger, louder, and more fractured with each passing generation.
The corruption of humanity reaches a sobering depth as the narrative widens its lens from individual failure and family conflict to a world-spanning condition, revealing that brokenness has become systemic rather than isolated, as widespread evil permeates human thought, intention, and behavior, shaping societies, relationships, and inner life alike, until violence, selfishness, and corruption are no longer exceptions but patterns woven into daily existence. Humanity's creative power, organizational ability, and cultural growth continue to advance, yet these capacities are increasingly directed toward self-exaltation, exploitation, and dominance rather than stewardship, compassion, and trust, demonstrating that the problem is not a lack of intelligence or capability, but a profound moral misalignment at the core of human desire. Scripture describes this corruption not merely as bad actions, but as a condition of the heart, where thoughts are continually oriented toward evil, indicating a deep inward distortion that influences choices before they become actions. And this emphasis reveals that the crisis facing humanity is internal before it is external, rooted in intention rather than circumstance. Violence spreads across the earth, not only as physical harm, but as a posture of life, where power is pursued without restraint, relationships are treated as transactional, and life itself is devalued, creating a world where fear replaces trust and strength replaces righteousness as the guiding principle of survival. The spread of evil also suggests normalization, as behaviors once recognized as destructive become accepted, justified, or even celebrated, showing how moral decline accelerates when conscience is dulled by repetition and community endorsement. God's response to this widespread corruption is described not in cold judgment, but in grief, a striking portrayal that reveals divine sorrow rather than detached authority, as God is grieved to his heart over what humanity has become, not because his power is threatened, but because relationship has been betrayed, and creation, once declared good, is now bent toward destruction. This grief underscores that humanity's direction matters deeply to God, that human choices are not insignificant or ignored, and that the Creator remains emotionally invested in the outcome of his creation, experiencing sorrow over the misuse of freedom and the suffering it produces. Divine grief also reveals that judgment does not arise from irritation or impatience, but from sustained concern, from watching harm multiply and life diminish, and recognizing that unchecked corruption will ultimately consume both humanity and the world entrusted to it. The direction humanity has taken is described as one moving steadily away from alignment with God, as independence hardens into defiance and autonomy replaces accountability, creating a trajectory where self becomes the ultimate reference point for meaning, morality, and value. This inward turn reshapes society as collective life begins to mirror individual desire, reinforcing systems that reward dominance, normalize violence, and marginalize restraint, making righteousness increasingly costly and rare. Humanity's direction is no longer neutral, drifting aimlessly, but actively oriented towards self-rule, revealing that corruption is not passive decay, but an active rejection of divine order, sustained through choice, habit, and collective reinforcement. God's grief also signals that continued tolerance of this direction would amount to abandonment, allowing humanity to destroy itself unchecked, and this realization sets the stage for decisive intervention, not as an act of cruelty, but as an attempt to halt a trajectory that leads only to deeper devastation. The portrayal of God grieving affirms that judgment and mercy are not opposites, but interconnected, because grief implies care, and care seeks to prevent irreversible harm, even when correction is painful.
Widespread evil thus represents a point of crisis where humanity's accumulated choices converge into a collective condition that threatens the future itself. As violence begets violence, corruption breeds further corruption, and hope for restoration appears increasingly distant. Yet even in this dark assessment, the narrative does not depict God as absent or indifferent, but as deeply aware, engaged, and responsive, weighing the cost of action against the cost of inaction, and recognizing that allowing corruption to continue unchecked would betray the original purpose of creation. Humanity's direction, shaped by freedom misused and desire unchecked, becomes a cautionary trajectory, illustrating that without alignment to something beyond the self, freedom collapses into chaos and power erodes responsibility. The corruption described is total in scope, but not in inevitability, because it is the result of cumulative choices rather than predetermined fate. And this distinction preserves the moral weight of the story, affirming that humanity's condition, though dire, is not accidental but chosen. God's grief also preserves the dignity of humanity even in condemnation, because sorrow acknowledges value, and grief implies that what is lost was worth preserving, reinforcing that humanity's worth has not been erased by its corruption, even as its direction has become destructive. The world at this stage stands at a crossroads, filled with people, structures, and culture, yet increasingly hollowed out by violence and self-interest, creating a tension between outward vitality and inward decay. Corruption of humanity therefore represents not merely moral failure, but existential misdirection, where the purpose of creation is reversed, and life meant to reflect goodness becomes a vehicle for harm. This moment in the narrative crystallizes the seriousness of human freedom, revealing that choices made collectively shape destiny, and that direction, once established and reinforced, carries momentum that becomes difficult to reverse. God's grief functions as both lament and warning, signaling that the path humanity has chosen cannot continue indefinitely without consequence, and that intervention, though severe, may be the only means of preserving the possibility of future life and restoration. The corruption of humanity thus stands as a profound diagnosis of the human condition, exposing the depth of brokenness that arises when trust is abandoned, desire becomes sovereign, and power replaces responsibility. And it prepares the way for decisive action that will confront not only behavior but direction itself, as the story moves toward a moment where humanity's future hangs in the balance between destruction and the possibility of renewal.
Noah emerges within a corrupted world as a quiet contrast rather than a dramatic hero, a single life oriented differently amid widespread moral decay. And the text describes him as a righteous man, not meaning flawless or untouched by the brokenness around him, but distinguished by integrity, trust, and alignment with God in a generation that had largely abandoned both. And this righteousness is relational before it is moral, rooted in walking with God rather than in public recognition or power, revealing that faithfulness does not require prominence to be meaningful. Noah's life stands as evidence that corruption, though widespread, is not total, and that even when evil becomes normalized, obedience remains possible, though often lonely and costly. And this possibility preserves the moral weight of the human story, showing that humanity's direction, while deeply bent, is not beyond response. God's favor toward Noah is not arbitrary preference, but recognition of posture, a response to a heart inclined toward trust rather than self-rule. And this favor does not remove Noah from the coming crisis, but places him at its center, demonstrating that divine favor often carries responsibility rather than exemption. God speaks to Noah with clarity and gravity, issuing a warning that the earth is filled with violence and that judgment is approaching, not as sudden impulse, but as the culmination of humanity's chosen direction. And this warning reveals that divine action is preceded by communication, invitation, and explanation, affirming that judgment is never uninformed or impulsive. The warning also places Noah in a position of knowledge that carries emotional and ethical weight as he becomes aware of coming destruction while continuing to live among those who remain unaware. And this awareness transforms obedience into an act of endurance, patience, and quiet faith rather than visible triumph. God's message to Noah is both sobering and purposeful, as it includes not only the announcement of judgment, but also a plan of preservation, outlining the construction of the ark as a means of sustaining life through the coming flood. And this plan reveals that divine judgment is never devoid of mercy, because even as corruption is confronted, life is protected, continuity is preserved, and the future is held in view. The ark itself becomes a symbol of obedience expressed through action, a tangible response to God's word that requires trust in what cannot yet be seen, because at the time of its construction there is no flood, no visible sign that would justify such effort by human logic alone, making Noah's obedience an act of faith rather than calculation. Building the ark demands perseverance, as it requires years of labor, repetition, and commitment without immediate validation, illustrating that obedience often unfolds over time rather than through sudden dramatic moments, and that faithfulness is sustained through consistency rather than intensity. Noah's righteousness is thus expressed not only in belief, but in action, as he follows instructions precisely, submits to divine guidance, and commits his life to a task whose significance extends beyond his own survival. And this obedience reflects trust that God's word is reliable even when circumstances offer no confirmation. The call to obedience also isolates Noah, setting him apart socially and culturally, because obedience in a corrupt world often appears foolish, excessive, or unnecessary, and this isolation underscores the cost of righteousness when collective norms have shifted away from moral alignment. Yet Noah's obedience is not framed as moral superiority, but as faithfulness, suggesting humility rather than pride. And this humility preserves the relational nature of righteousness, keeping it grounded in trust rather than self-righteousness. God's warning to Noah also carries urgency because it reveals that humanity's direction has reached a point where correction through gradual means is no longer sufficient, and that decisive action is required to interrupt a trajectory of destruction. And this urgency places Noah at a critical threshold, where obedience becomes the means through which mercy will operate. The call to obedience includes not only building the ark, but also preparing for preservation of life, gathering animals, securing provisions, and organizing space, showing that obedience engages practical wisdom alongside spiritual trust, and that faith does not negate responsibility, but deepens it. Noah's response is notably unembellished, as Scripture emphasizes simply that he did everything God commanded him, a statement that highlights obedience as completeness rather than perfection, faithfulness rather than spectacle. And this simplicity underscores that righteousness often manifests quietly through consistency rather than through dramatic gestures. Noah's righteousness is thus expressed not only in belief, but in action, as he follows instructions precisely, submits to divine guidance, and commits his life to a task whose significance extends beyond his own survival. And this obedience reflects trust that God's word is reliable even when circumstances offer no confirmation. The call to obedience also isolates Noah, setting him apart socially and culturally, because obedience in a corrupt world often appears foolish, excessive, or unnecessary, and this isolation underscores the cost of righteousness when collective norms have shifted away from moral alignment. Yet Noah's obedience is not framed as moral superiority, but as faithfulness, suggesting humility rather than pride. And this humility preserves the relational nature of righteousness, keeping it grounded in trust rather than self-righteousness.
God's warning to Noah also carries urgency because it reveals that humanity's direction has reached a point where correction through gradual means is no longer sufficient, and that decisive action is required to interrupt a trajectory of destruction. And this urgency places Noah at a critical threshold where obedience becomes the means through which mercy will operate. The call to obedience includes not only building the ark, but also preparing for preservation of life, gathering animals, securing provisions, and organizing space, showing that obedience engages practical wisdom alongside spiritual trust, and that faith does not negate responsibility but deepens it. Noah's response is notably unembellished, as Scripture emphasizes simply that he did everything God commanded him, a statement that highlights obedience as completeness rather than perfection, faithfulness rather than spectacle. And this simplicity underscores that righteousness often manifests quietly through consistency rather than through dramatic gestures. Noah's righteousness is thus expressed not only in belief, but in action, as he follows instructions precisely, submits to divine guidance, and commits his life to a task whose significance extends beyond his own survival. And this obedience reflects trust that God's word is reliable even when circumstances offer no confirmation. The call to obedience also isolates Noah, setting him apart socially and culturally, because obedience in a corrupt world often appears foolish, excessive, or unnecessary, and this isolation underscores the cost of righteousness when collective norms have shifted away from moral alignment. Yet Noah's obedience is not framed as moral superiority, but as faithfulness, suggesting humility rather than pride. And this humility preserves the relational nature of righteousness, keeping it grounded in trust rather than self-righteousness. God's warning to Noah also carries urgency because it reveals that humanity's direction has reached a point where correction through gradual means is no longer sufficient, and that decisive action is required to interrupt a trajectory of destruction. And this urgency places Noah at a critical threshold where obedience becomes the means through which mercy will operate. The call to obedience includes not only building the ark, but also preparing for preservation of life, gathering animals, securing provisions, and organizing space, showing that obedience engages practical wisdom alongside spiritual trust, and that faith does not negate responsibility but deepens it. Noah's response is notably unembellished, as Scripture emphasizes simply that he did everything God commanded him, a statement that highlights obedience as completeness rather than perfection, faithfulness rather than spectacle. And this simplicity underscores that righteousness often manifests quietly through consistency rather than through dramatic gestures. Noah's righteousness is thus expressed not only in belief, but in action, as he follows instructions precisely, submits to divine guidance, and commits his life to a task whose significance extends beyond his own survival. And this obedience reflects trust that God's word is reliable even when circumstances offer no confirmation. The call to obedience also isolates Noah, setting him apart socially and culturally, because obedience in a corrupt world often appears foolish, excessive, or unnecessary, and this isolation underscores the cost of righteousness when collective norms have shifted away from moral alignment.
The ark and the flood represent the most dramatic convergence of judgment and preservation in the early human story, as obedience that had long been expressed quietly through years of faithful labor now becomes the dividing line between destruction and survival, beginning with the building of the ark itself, a massive, deliberate undertaking that stands as a physical embodiment of trust in God's word. Constructed not in response to visible danger, but in anticipation of it, requiring Noah to commit time, strength, and resources to a task whose logic defied ordinary experience. And this prolonged act of construction becomes a lived testimony to faith, as each measured beam and sealed joint reflects confidence not in circumstance but in divine instruction. The ark rises slowly against the backdrop of a world that continues in its corruption, its sheer presence both a warning and an invitation, though no response is recorded, emphasizing that obedience does not guarantee influence or understanding, only faithfulness. The ark's design is purposeful rather than ornate, shaped for preservation rather than comfort, revealing that rescue does not always appear glorious, but often practical, restrained, and focused on sustaining life through hardship rather than avoiding hardship altogether. As the time of judgment arrives, animals begin to enter the ark, not driven by human control, but guided by divine orchestration, pairs of creatures moving toward refuge in quiet obedience to a call beyond instinct, illustrating that preservation of life is comprehensive, extending beyond humanity to the broader created order, and affirming that God's care encompasses all living things rather than human survival alone. This gathering of animals transforms the ark into a living microcosm of creation, a fragile sanctuary carrying diversity, vulnerability, and continuity within its wooden frame. And this image underscores the theme that judgment does not aim at annihilation, but at containment, restraining corruption while safeguarding the seed of renewal. Noah's role in receiving the animals reflects stewardship under pressure, as responsibility continues even as catastrophe looms, reinforcing that obedience remains active rather than passive, requiring attentiveness, order, and perseverance until the very moment the ark is sealed. The closing of the ark marks a point of no return, a moment where divine action decisively separates those within from the world without. And this separation is not arbitrary, but aligned with response, trust, and obedience, signaling that choices made over time culminate in irreversible outcomes. When the waters finally come, they do so with overwhelming force, as fountains of the deep burst forth and the heavens release their rain, undoing the separations that once shaped the world, as boundaries between sea and land collapse and waters rise to reclaim what had been ordered, illustrating that judgment mirrors creation in reverse, not as chaos unleashed randomly, but as structured undoing of a world that has resisted order. The floodwaters cover the earth relentlessly, rising beyond fields and cities, erasing distinctions of power, status, and achievement, revealing the fragility of human structures when confronted with forces beyond control, and demonstrating that no fortress, legacy, or invention can substitute for alignment with God. As the waters rise, life outside the ark is extinguished, a sobering reality that underscores the seriousness of corruption and the cost of misused freedom. And this loss is not minimized or softened because the narrative refuses to trivialize judgment, instead presenting it as a necessary interruption to a trajectory that would otherwise lead only to greater destruction. Inside the ark, life continues in confinement and uncertainty as Noah, his family, and the animals endure darkness, noise, and motion, sustained not by understanding but by trust, floating between past and future with no control over direction or duration. And this experience transforms obedience into endurance, as survival now depends on patience rather than action. The ark becomes a place of waiting, where faith must persist without immediate resolution, and where hope is sustained not by visible land, but by confidence that God's promise holds even when surrounded by water and loss. The flood reshapes the earth entirely, erasing the familiar and preparing space for something new. And this reshaping emphasizes that judgment is not an endpoint, but a threshold, clearing what cannot be healed in order to preserve what can be renewed.
The covering of the earth by water also echoes themes of cleansing, not in a simplistic sense, but as a drastic measure required when corruption has permeated every level of life, suggesting that some forms of brokenness cannot be reformed gradually, but must be confronted decisively. Throughout the flood, God remains attentive to those within the ark, preserving life through provision, structure, and containment, reinforcing that mercy operates even in the midst of judgment, sustaining continuity while addressing corruption. The ark's survival amid the waters becomes a testimony that obedience does not prevent suffering, but provides refuge within it, offering preservation rather than exemption. And this distinction reframes faith not as escape from consequence, but as alignment that carries one through consequence. Animals and humans alike depend entirely on the integrity of the ark, illustrating the interconnectedness of life and the importance of faithfulness in sustaining more than oneself, as Noah's obedience becomes the means by which countless lives are preserved. The floodwaters eventually reach their peak, covering even the highest ground, symbolizing the totality of judgment and the completeness of interruption, leaving no space untouched by consequence. And this completeness underscores that partial correction would not suffice, as the depth of corruption required a response equal in scope. The ark, floating alone on the vast expanse of water, becomes a solitary sign of hope in a world otherwise silenced, carrying within it the fragile promise of renewal, continuity, and future possibility. The ark and the flood together revealed that divine judgment and divine mercy are not competing impulses, but coordinated actions, one restraining destruction, the other preserving life, both aimed toward restoration rather than annihilation. This chapter of the story stands as a sobering reminder that actions accumulate, directions matter, and consequences unfold over time. Yet it also affirms that even in moments of overwhelming loss, God's purpose includes preservation, guidance, and safeguarding future hope, as life is carried through the waters not by chance, but by obedience, trust, and divine care, setting the stage for a world that will emerge changed, humbled, and given the opportunity to begin again.
Renewal begins quietly after the violence of the flood, not with spectacle, but with patience, as the waters that once covered the earth begin to recede slowly, deliberately, revealing a world altered and emptied, where silence replaces chaos and waiting replaces fear. And this gradual retreat of the waters reflects a restoration that unfolds through time rather than instant reversal, emphasizing that healing after judgment is a process, not a moment. The ark comes to rest not as a triumphant vessel, but as a humble survivor, perched upon newly exposed ground. And this resting marks the first sign that destruction has reached its limit and that preservation has fulfilled its purpose, as life carried through judgment now stands on the threshold of renewal. Noah waits still, attentive rather than impulsive, releasing birds to test the world beyond the ark. And this careful observation reveals that wisdom after catastrophe requires discernment, patience, and trust, as the earth must be ready to receive life again before life rushes forward. When dry ground finally appears and God calls Noah out of the ark, the act of stepping onto land becomes an act of courage and hope, because this world is unfamiliar, reshaped, and uncertain, carrying both the memory of loss and the possibility of beginning again. Noah's first response is worship, an offering not of desperation but of gratitude, acknowledging preservation and recognizing that survival itself is a gift. And this act reorients humanity's posture in the renewed world, placing reverence before productivity and relationship before expansion.
God's response to this offering reveals a shift in divine commitment as he establishes a covenant not only with Noah, but with all living creatures, affirming that despite humanity's persistent brokenness, the cycles of total destruction will not be repeated, and that the stability of the world will be preserved, marking a turning point where mercy becomes explicitly promised rather than implied. The covenant acknowledges human frailty honestly, recognizing that the inclination of the human heart remains flawed, yet it refuses to make perfection the condition for preservation, revealing a divine resolve to sustain life even within imperfection. And this resolve reshapes the future by grounding it in grace rather than idealism. The new beginning after the flood is therefore not a return to Eden, but a continuation under altered conditions, where life resumes with clearer boundaries, deeper awareness, and a renewed mandate to fill the earth, steward it, and respect life, including explicit recognition of the value of human life, reinforcing dignity within a world that has witnessed its violation. The rainbow appears as the sign of this covenant, not as a tool of function, but as a symbol of remembrance, stretching across the sky as a visual bridge between heaven and earth, reminding both humanity and God of the promise made. And this symbol transforms the sky, once a source of fear during the flood, into a canvas of assurance, showing that the same heavens that poured out judgment now bear witness to restraint. The rainbow's arc, encompassing multiple colors unified in a single span, reflects diversity held within order, suggesting that the renewed world will continue to be complex and varied, yet held together by divine commitment rather than human control. This promise introduces hope not as denial of future suffering, but as assurance of continuity, declaring that seasons will continue, that cycles of planting and harvest, cold and heat, day and night will persist, anchoring human existence in predictability despite moral uncertainty. Hope for humanity emerges not from confidence in human improvement, but from trust in divine faithfulness, because the covenant is unilateral, grounded in God's decision rather than humanity's performance, ensuring that the future remains open even when humanity falters. The renewed world carries forward memory as well as promise, because humanity now lives with knowledge of consequence and preservation, aware that destruction is possible but not ultimate, and that mercy sets limits on judgment. The covenant reframes humanity's relationship with creation, emphasizing responsibility, restraint, and respect, as life is recognized as sacred and violence is explicitly condemned, signaling an attempt to redirect human direction without erasing freedom. The post-flood world is therefore marked by realism rather than innocence, acknowledging brokenness while sustaining hope. And this realism becomes the foundation for human history moving forward, where trust must be chosen consciously rather than assumed. The rainbow promise stands as a constant reminder that God's relationship with humanity is not transactional but committed, not fragile but enduring, offering stability in a world that remains vulnerable to human failure. Hope for humanity is thus grounded not in the absence of future storms, but in the assurance that storms will not erase the possibility of life, meaning, and renewal. The covenant establishes a moral horizon, reminding humanity that while actions have consequences, existence itself is upheld by mercy, creating space for repentance, growth, and continuity. As the world begins again, populated by survivors rather than innocents, humanity steps into a future shaped by both warning and promise, carrying the weight of responsibility alongside the gift of preservation. Renewal does not erase sorrow, but integrates it into wisdom, teaching that loss can coexist with hope, and that memory of judgment can guide restraint rather than despair. The waters receding signal that destruction is not God's final intention, and the rainbow confirms that commitment to life surpasses response to failure,
anchoring hope in divine resolve rather than human consistency. The covenant becomes a foundational assurance that the story will continue, that history is not closed by catastrophe, and that even after profound judgment, the Creator remains invested in humanity's future. Hope for humanity is therefore not naive optimism, but resilient trust, rooted in a promise that transcends circumstance, affirming that while the world is changed, it is not abandoned, and that life, though marked by fragility and responsibility, is sustained under a sky that now bears the sign of mercy, reminding every generation that renewal is possible, that beginnings can follow endings, and that the arc of the story, though marked by judgment, is ultimately held within a covenant of faithfulness, restraint, and enduring hope.